Hello and welcome, one and all, to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's good to be with you all again for another edition of our regular weekly program brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education and Public Affairs and us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, working together to bring you what has been a now long-running and just fantastic series of lunchtime programs. So I hope that you've got your brown bag there at your desk or at your place of residence, wherever you happen to be. Maybe you're enjoying the nice sunshine outside somewhere, wherever you are, with your lunch, and you're ready to learn something new and interesting. That's what we do here at the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We meet interesting people who are doing interesting things out there in the world of science or technology, education, nature and the environment, all of the above. We like to meet these people, hear about what they're interested in, what they're doing, and then what's really great is we give you the opportunity to ask your questions. That's right. We've got the experts. You've got the questions. So throughout today's program, viewers, make sure that you are dropping your questions, your thoughts, your comments, maybe your stories and experiences as well into the chat if you're on YouTube, or in the comments if you're watching on Facebook. That way we can get your questions over to today's special guest. Now, I know that everybody's probably very excited to hear about today's topic because, well, people aren't exactly creatures that go out at night, and we tend to not know very much about the animals of the night. So we've went and gotten an expert who does know something about them, and I think is going to have some great stories to tell. Everybody, I want you to meet Falyn Owens. Falyn is the Extension Wildlife Biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and interestingly, runs or helps run the Wildlife Helpline, which I think is a phone number that like white-tailed deer can call when they're feeling scared. And okay, that wasn't it at all. Falyn, welcome to the program.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for the introduction.
Was I right about the helpline?
Certainly if a wild animal can like punch in the numbers, we would take the call to the best of our ability. But mostly it's for people who have questions or concerns about a wildlife encounter that they've recently had. And we've got biologists who staff that phone number and basically provide all the information that a person needs to do the right thing, to whatever action is needed or no action to deal with the encounter.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited for some of these biologists' stories of North Carolina's nightlife.
Well, I'm very excited to be able to present. It's a variety. It's going to be a smorgasbord, so I hope it's entertaining for everybody. So should I get started?
Take it away.
You're giving it to me? All right, I'll take
all yours.
I'll take control, and I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me while I get everything set up and make sure I've got all the boxes clicked that need to be clicked, and switch my presenter mode real quick. And I think I need to hide this. So now I think we should be good. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to talk about some nocturnal wildlife in North Carolina. And I do want to say right off the bat that my job is not necessarily to be an expert in nocturnal wildlife, but this presentation is built on the backs of some amazing wildlife biologists who work for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, whose job it is to conserve and manage wildlife in North Carolina very actively, to learn about the wildlife we have and to do what's necessary to protect and conserve those species. So they do things like surveilling and monitoring the species that we have, and the data that are collected from these biologists are used to make impactful management decisions about what one can or cannot do with these species or the habitats they live in. So the work that these biologists do have real impact on the wildlife in North Carolina. And my job today is just to tell some of their stories, and with a special focus on our nocturnal species. So before I really go too much into the individual stories, I want to do a little refresher about what it really means to be nocturnal. I'm going to start with a basic diagram. We've got, very simple day on the top here and night on the bottom, pretty simple enough. Most of us are familiar with the idea that some animals are awake during the day and some are more active at night. And those are your diurnal and nocturnal species, respectively. I think most people are familiar with that. Um, but it's actually much more complicated than that. Those pale sections on the left and the right are the between night and day. That's dawn and dusk. Not quite night, not quite day. And there's actually plenty of animals that are neither diurnal nor nocturnal, but are actually most active at dawn and dusk. And we call those animals crepuscular. You may or may not have ever heard that term, but that's your sort of in-between species. And it gets even more complicated than that if you really want to get super technical about it. Some species are most active at dawn, and those animals are called matutinal. Some species are most active at dusk, and they're called vespertine. And then you get those crazy species that just do whatever they want, whenever they want, and they can be active day or night or in between, doesn't matter. They do what they do. And those species are called cathemeral. So we've got a lot of categories here, much more than just the typical diurnal and nocturnal that most people are familiar with. But the real fun happens when we start looking at the difference between these neat and tidy scientific categories and the actual way that wildlife behave. So the funny thing is that for anybody who actually studies wildlife, who actually goes out and is monitoring wildlife, trying to find them, trying to figure out what they're doing and when, any biologist finds out at some point that no one told the species that they're supposed to fit into these neat and tidy categories. These categories are helpful and they make it easier for us to think about wildlife and communicate with each other about animal behavior. But these are not hard and fast rules, just like humans, which, humans are supposed to be diurnal, but plenty of people stay up all night for a variety of reasons. We've all heard of night owls. So the whole idea of nocturnal is a little bit more slippery than some hard and fast category. And I'm going to give you some examples. So raccoons. Okay, I'm going to start off with raccoons. Most people in North Carolina understand that raccoons are nocturnal. But in the springtime, when raccoon mothers are busy raising their young, just like any parent that has very young children can attest, raising young is definitely an around-the-clock job. You're lucky if there's such a thing as sleeping all night, or in the case of raccoons, sleeping all day. Raccoon parents have to work around the clock to find enough food to produce the milk that their young need to grow up healthy and strong, and to protect them and get them out of whatever trouble they get into, because young animals are just as troublesome as young people. So in the case of a lot of wild parents, or this is the case for a lot of different species, especially during the springtime when it's kind of the breeding season and a lot of species are reproducing and having young. And in my line of work, so a little bit of my story, I look at the data on an annual basis, and we see a big spike in the calls that we get, the Wildlife Commission gets, about potentially rabid raccoons and foxes in North Carolina every spring and summer, right around breeding season when they're raising young. So, when I have conversations with people who have seen a raccoon out during the daytime or a fox out during the daytime, and I have a conversation with them about, what did it look like? What was it doing? Most of the time, this animal was behaving for all intents and purposes completely normally. It was appearing healthy. It was going about its life, doing what it was doing. It was just out during the daytime, and that was the cause of concern. And like I said, during the breeding season, these wild animals have a lot of reasons to be awake at during the daytime, even if they're technically nocturnal species. So if you see a raccoon or fox or whatever out during the daytime in the springtime, it's probably just haggard and like, oh my goodness, I'm just trying to like keep everybody fed, leave me alone. Unless it looks sick, it's probably not rabid. But I do want to put out a disclaimer. Do not try to pet wild animals just because I told you this. If a wild animal ever lets you get close enough to pet it, then it might actually be sick. So you do not want to be handling it. Okay, so moving on from that, let's talk a little bit about sea turtles. So sea turtles are diurnal. They're normally awake during the daytime, swimming around, eating jellyfish, living their best sea turtle life. But when it's time for a female sea turtle to lay eggs, she waits until the cover of night to do so. So sea turtles always lay their eggs at night because, this is an animal that is biologically designed to swim in the water, but not to be very active or able to defend themselves on land. So when they go onto a beach to lay their eggs, they're incredibly vulnerable, and their eggs are very vulnerable and exposed. And it can take hours to drag themselves up to a safe spot on the beach, to laboriously flipper by flipperful, dig the hole, and then lay the eggs one or two at a time, usually around 80 or so eggs. And then slowly cover the nest back up and go back into the water. So during that time, when they're exposed to all sorts of potential predators, aerial predators like seagulls and land predators, what the female does to prevent herself from putting herself and her eggs at risk is to do it at night when everything's a little bit more quiet. It's harder to see what she's doing, for predators, that is. And so it's the safest for her. So there's a case of a diurnal animal that has very specific behaviors that they very intentionally do just at night, because that is when it's most safe for them. Now, if you ever go vacationing on any of the beaches around here, or especially south of here, you might see signs at your beach house or on the beach during the breeding season about keeping the lights out. And that's because female sea turtles can get basically scared off by bright lights because it's not safe for them to lay eggs where they're visible and easily seen by predators. And you can imagine our beaches are so developed that there's not really very many places where there aren't people where sea turtles can actually safely build their nests. So that's what those signs are about. It's all about shutting off the lights, cutting off the floodlights and the porch lights and closing the curtains at night so that those sea turtles can come and lay their eggs and go back to their business, and everybody can live happily. So turn your lights off at night if you're on the beach during, May through October. Okay, now switching things up a little bit more, I got one more example of an animal that's categorized one way in terms of its activity cycle, but changes its behavior depending on what's going on in its environment. So white-tailed deer, they are one of the species that is categorized as crepuscular, so most active at dawn and dusk. But deer are also, they change their activity behavior depending on the activities of humans. And that's pretty common for a lot of species that coexist with us. So during the regulated hunting season, when human hunters are in the woods hoping to bring home some fresh venison, deer actually respond to the presence of hunters in the woods by becoming more nocturnal, because legal hunting hours are only during the daytime. You cannot legally hunt at night. So deer kind of catch on to this. They realize the hunters go away at night and they're safer when they're moving around at night. So during the hunting season, deer go from being crepuscular to nocturnal as an adaptive way to stay safe and avoid those hunters. One of the reasons why deer hunting can be so challenging. By the way, does anybody see the perfectly healthy raccoons eating the deer corn in this shot during the daytime? When there's food around, raccoons will be active anytime during day or night, let me tell you. Okay, so now that I've hopefully really kind of muddied the waters for you in terms of how precise the idea of being nocturnal is, or how fast and hard that category can be for a wildlife, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about our experiences with nocturnal wildlife. So one of the things that has caused a major boost in awareness of the wildlife that lives around us all the time is the widespread use of home surveillance systems, your doorbell cams, things like that, and trail cameras, which are becoming more popular every year. There's cameras basically all over the place, and people are suddenly able to see the wildlife that has been there all along. So I've got a short clip of a news story that was put out by WCNC out of Charlotte recently as an example of what happens when people suddenly notice the wildlife that lives around them.
Video tonight, a terrifying sight caught on surveillance camera, a bobcat wandering through a Charlotte homeowner's backyard. The bobcat appears to be casually strolling through, minding its own business. NBC Charlotte's Rob Hughes spoke to a local
it goes on to
wildlife.
talk about the fact that, yeah, bobcats live around. They're pretty much everywhere. And most of the time people never notice them because they don't bother anybody. But, you notice they use the word terrifying, oh no, there was a bobcat. And so this is one of the examples of how wildlife education can sometimes be very trial by fire, when suddenly people realize that, oh, I caught this animal on camera, and it's probably lived there its entire life, was probably born in the area. The only thing different is suddenly it's there. So anyway, this has been an exciting time for wildlife educators, let me tell you. And here's just another quick example of a species that most people think are nocturnal, that suddenly they're finding out is living right next to them. So that right there is a coyote that was spotted by a Ring camera. And coyotes they're either cathemeral, like living or being active anytime, day or night, or crepuscular, depending on who you ask. Basically, they're usually most active when people are not. So oftentimes they're perceived as nocturnal just because they don't want to be bothered by people, and they would rather go about their business when we're not awake. But I can guarantee that no matter where you live in North Carolina or pretty much the entire United States, this is something you could see out of your own front yard, because coyotes are pretty much everywhere now. And most of the time they don't bother anybody. They keep the rabbit and mole and rat population down. Okay, we're gonna switch it up a little bit, and I'm gonna present some stories about wildlife, nocturnal wildlife, that are hidden in plain sight. So we're going to start with the plethodontid salamanders. These guys are pretty cool. They actually don't have lungs. The plethodontid salamanders are lungless salamanders, and they do all of their breathing through their skin. And we've got a ton of species in North Carolina, really, really great diversity of these salamanders. This one is a red-legged salamander, which only lives in a very small part of Western North Carolina. And pretty much all of these species are nocturnal. And finding plethodontid salamanders is really not about, it's really all about when you look for them more than where you look for them. And even though they're nocturnal, it's not just about looking for them at night when they're most active. According to Jeff Hall, which is one of our lead herpetologists with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, who was very excited to tell me all about plethodontid salamanders, you could go to the perfect spot for these guys and flip over all the rocks and logs all day long looking for them, or all night long, and you wouldn't see a single one of them. It'd just be like, oh, there must be none here. And the reason for that is because they don't have lungs and they breathe through their skin, like our lungs, which have to stay moist in order to be able to effectively exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. These salamanders, since their skin acts as their lungs, their skin has to stay moist or they can't breathe. So most of the time, they're just kind of deep under the leaf duff in that nice moist soil and leaf litter layer during normal dry periods so that they can successfully breathe. But if you go out, Jeff tells me, if you go out right after a rain, or even, in a light rain, it's been raining for a minute, really, really humid air, and you're going out at night, that's when they come out, and that's when you can find them. So here's an example of one of the surveys that they were doing, just looking for whatever salamanders were in the area. And so Jeff said that they were out for less than an hour in just one small area, and these are all the guys that they found. And this is 4 different species of plethodontid salamanders that they found all in the same area, just going out at the right time in the moist conditions that these guys actually come out. And he said, it's hard not to step on them. They're just like all over the place all of a sudden. So if you're interested in salamanders, that's when you need to go out and look for them. And Jeff tells me that we have like an amazing diversity of plethodontid salamanders, somewhere between 60 and 70 different species. And this is kind of one of the forefronts of herpetology in our state, at least, is trying to figure out exactly how many species we have, because it's kind of undecided. We're not exactly sure. So that's kind of the frontier of salamander science, is how many species of plethodontid salamanders we have in North Carolina. Okay, so now I'm going to do another hidden in plain sight story, and this one is going to be, you guys knew I was going to talk about bats. It had to come up in a talk about nocturnal wildlife. So I'm going to talk about gray bats, and not just gray bats, but the gray bat, a single gray bat. This is one of my favorite stories that I got to hear from our biologist when I was looking around for people who had cool things to tell about our nocturnal wildlife. This one's from our bat biologist in North Carolina, Catherine Etchison. And so this is the story of the first gray bat ever really truly recorded as living in North Carolina. So gray bats they're federally endangered. They're pretty rare. And they roost in limestone karsts or caves and they're really, really picky about where they roost. The caves have to be really deep, and they have to have water running through them. And this type of environment is pretty common in Kentucky, our neighboring state, but not so much here in North Carolina. So, for decades, people who were surveying for bats very, very, very rarely found gray bats in North Carolina. And they were always kind of close to the Kentucky line. So it was assumed that since these particular bats have a pretty large home range, they must have just been flying over from Kentucky, and, they actually roost in Kentucky. And they're just coming over temporarily, and that's why we found it. But they can't possibly live here because we don't have the right roosting conditions for them. But in 2016, Chris Kelly, our Western bird and squirrel biologist, she was birding off of a bridge on the French Broad River, and she saw a bat on the ground on the bridge, this very bat, in fact. And so it was sunning itself right at the edge of an expansion joint, minding its own business. But she heard chittering coming from inside the joint, bat chittering. So, of course, she called Catherine Etchison, our bat biologist, and say, hey, there's bats in this bridge. You should come and check it out. And of course she did. By the way, this is a big brown bat. And by big, the biggest bats in North Carolina are about the size of a mouse. So we don't have very big bats. We don't have like the big fruit bats that, are, I don't know, the size of a cat or something like that. We have very, very tiny bats. Even our biggest ones are pretty tiny. So Catherine and her technician go out to the bridge, and they do an evening emergence survey. Basically, they go out at dusk and they wait until the bats leave for the evening and try to count and see how many bats are there. They also put out acoustic recorders to record the sounds that the bats make as they're leaving, because different species of bats make different sounds, and the acoustic recorders can pick up how many species were present. So there were a lot of bats in the bridge, hundreds actually. It's very exciting. There were definitely big brown bats, but the acoustic recorders were picking up some other species of bats mixed in. And Catherine figured it was probably Mexican free-tailed bats, which are very well known for roosting in bridges. But when she went home and actually did the analysis with the acoustic recorders, they picked up gray bats. And this would be the first ever recorded instance of a gray bat roosting in North Carolina. So, of course, they had to go back and get more information. So they went back during the daytime, and they were literally crawling around on their bellies on this bridge, like peering into these dark joints, trying to see what was in there. And they saw some bats. This is actually a photograph of what they saw. And it's definitely not big brown bats. So they took a snake hook and very, very gently, very carefully kind of nudged it in the direction upward out of the joint so that they could get a better look at it. And this is what they found. This little guy right here was the first record of a gray bat roosting in North Carolina. And you can see a little band, the little aluminum band that goes on its forewings, so that we can keep track of it if anybody ever catches it again, figure out how long it lives and where it goes. Very exciting. And this is Catherine herself with the bat. And she says this was the most exciting moment of her career so far. So really, really cool instance of discovery, being a wildlife researcher. And so this instance actually led to a research project funded by the North Carolina Department of Transportation that has since found gray bats roosting in 12 different counties here in North Carolina, all in bridges and culverts, and none of them in the caves that were previously thought to be the only places that gray bats would roost. Okay, so those are my stories of wildlife hiding in plain sight. Now I want to move on to a couple stories about nocturnal wildlife that are just plain elusive. So first off, I want to talk about barn owls. So the first barn owl I ever saw was in Jim Henson's masterpiece, Labyrinth. If you've never seen that movie, I highly recommend it. It's a great fantasy. And I remember being struck at the very beginning of the movie. A barn owl sweeps in and lands on this perch. And I just remember thinking, like, how beautiful and mysterious and majestic this bird was. This actually might have been one of the formative moments that made me want to study birds when I grew up. And I ended up getting a master's degree in birds, essentially, among maybe some other fascinations that likely arose from watching that movie. Anyway, so it turns out barn owls are actually pretty mysterious, at least in North Carolina. Globally, they're found in most of the world, especially the Southern Hemisphere. They're pretty ubiquitous and can be found almost anywhere. But they have these really large home ranges, up to 20 square miles. And because they're nocturnal, and like all owls, they are dead silent most of the time, unless they call and they make noise with their mouths. They're completely silent when they fly. So they're just really hard to keep track of. To the point where the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission actually is asking for reports from people like you and me. If you go out and see a barn owl, we want to hear about it, because they're just so hard to monitor to get a good estimate on exactly how they're doing in our state. We're actually listed as a species of special concern in North Carolina, which is a category it's not quite threatened or endangered, but since we don't have enough information to go on and we're not getting a lot of reports, there is a possibility that their numbers could be imperiled. We just really need to know more. So they are a species of special concern. And like I said, we're always interested in getting reports. So I have Allison Medford is basically our lead barn owl biologist here in North Carolina. And there's her contact information. So if you ever see one, she would love to know. And some of the stuff that she's doing to conserve or provide habitat for barn owls is actually installing barn owl nest boxes. So barn owls, like their name implies, they really love open fields, large expanses of open fields and farmland. And they do indeed like to nest in barns. But their natural habitat is like cliff shelves and big tree hollows, which are hard to come by in nature. So when they can get into a barn and nest there, that makes a good substitute sort of nesting environment for them. But to help them out and give them even more opportunity to raise young, we actually install these barn owl condos that protect. It's basically a flat platform. They don't build a nest. They kind of just line the nest with, honestly, owl pellets and maybe some down feathers. And that's what they use. They just want an empty platform, and they lay their eggs right on the platform. And these condos just provide a safe space away from the wind and the rain to protect their young. And even though we still don't know that much about them, and although I think she did say, Allison told me that one of the surprising things that they found out is that barn owls, even though they have a long period that they can nest, they nest more often in the fall, very late in the season than anybody really thought before. So that's one of the neat factoids that she's been able to discover, and our other biologists, about what barn owls are doing here in North Carolina. Evidently, they like the fall weather to raise their young. And here's some of the aftermath of putting up those nest boxes. Of course, when those boxes are monitored for activity, and when they find barn owls nesting in them, they keep very close watch. And when the owlets are just the right age, they actually go into the nest box and pull the owlets out, and each of them gets a little leg band with a number on it so that we can keep track of them, and they get checked over for how healthy they are, and then they get put right back in there. So it's funny, barn owls are not nearly as mysterious and beautiful when they don't have their adult plumage fully in. They kind of look a little awkward, but I guess who isn't when they're super young? And this is actually my last story. I wanted to finish off with another very, very elusive nocturnal species, the spotted skunk. So these guys are super cute, and we've got two species of skunks in North Carolina, both nocturnal. The striped skunk is fairly common. They're sighted, pretty often. They live around people. They get hit by cars a lot. So, we know a lot about striped skunks, but spotted skunks are much smaller. They're only about the size of a large squirrel, and they kind of have a lot more patterning going on in their fur versus a striped skunk usually has just the two main stripes. But spotted skunks have like lots of stripes and spots mixed in. They're really, really cool little animals, and they are just hard. They're really, really hard to find. Sometimes just by, pure luck, they're spotted on trail cameras, like the image that you see here. But when researchers go out to try to intentionally go and find them, find out where they are and where they're not, and try to get an estimate on their numbers and what habitat they prefer, they're just nowhere to be found. So Colleen Offenbuttle, our bear and fur bearer biologist, has been working to figure out a way to consistently keep track of these guys. And she was telling me she's tried different things. They've tried tube traps, nothing, basically just to get them on camera, get them to go someplace consistently, to get them on camera if they're in a location or not. But they're just so inconsistent, and they do what they want to do. So we don't really know too much about where they are here in North Carolina. In general, we know about spotted skunks. As a matter of fact, um, one of my favorite things about them, when they feel threatened, they do handstands, and they're the cutest, stinkiest handstands in the world. This is a threat display to make themselves look bigger. Again, these are only the size of a or a large squirrel. So if you see a spotted skunk do this, it's basically telling you, please get away from me or I'm going to spray. And they have very good aim. They kind of tilt their tail over and they can aim for the eyes. This is not something that you would want to see in person, but remotely, via webinar, it's a very cute behavior. So anyway, these guys are pretty neat. And by all means, the same thing with the barn owls. If you ever see one, if you catch one on camera or you find a road-killed one or anything like that, this is definitely one of the species that we're trying to get as much information about as possible. So please report it. One of the ways you can do it, report it, is to contact the Wildlife Resources Commission directly, or you can actually go to iNaturalist, which, if you are not familiar with iNaturalist, it is an app that is wonderful for recording wildlife observations and helping you identify wildlife and plants and fungi and all sorts of living things. Highly recommend it if you're not familiar with it. But you can report sightings of eastern spotted skunks on iNaturalist if you don't want to call the Wildlife Commission. So please, if you spot any rare or interesting wildlife, let us know. This is what the Wildlife Commission does. We monitor and survey for wildlife, nocturnal and otherwise, and get out there and try to spot some nocturnal wildlife if you get the chance. And let us know if you find anything cool. Now that's all the stories that I have. I think I went pretty quickly, so I apologize for that, but hopefully it was entertaining and you guys learned a little bit of something about our nocturnal wildlife. I am going to stop sharing my screen if I can here, and we can go into Q&A. Hey, there's Chris.
Falyn, thank you so much.
Oh, yay. I had so much fun researching this presentation. I don't necessarily do a ton of work specifically on nocturnal wildlife, although working with the helpline and being an extension biologist, which is to teach people about wildlife encounters that they might have, nocturnal wildlife definitely comes up a lot. But I learned so much just figuring out some of the stories that are going on in terms of the research that's being done on these species.
Yeah, thanks for pulling those together and sharing them here. Those are really good stories. Excellent stories. Viewers, let me remind you, go ahead and drop your questions about nocturnal wildlife in North Carolina, or about maybe being an extension biologist for the WRC into the chat. Whatever questions you've got, let us know. I'll be turning to your questions here in just a moment. And I see some of them are starting to roll in. But I was going to ask if you've gotten any, let's say, peculiar calls about nocturnal wildlife and on the helpline, something that stumped you.
Oh my goodness.
Initially.
So one of the things that people contact us for is help with identifying pictures that they get of wildlife that they've gotten on a camera. And if the photo was taken at night, and especially if the animal was moving quickly and the picture is really blurry, sometimes it can be a matter of, well, I can give you my best guess of what this is, but there's just literally not enough information in the picture to make a really good, solid ID of that animal. And so, we'll get pictures sent of all sorts of things that, for all intents and purposes, mostly turn out to be things like coyotes, gray foxes, red foxes, what's some of the other really common ones, bobcats, and people are just really stumped. They don't know what they are. Oh, house cats. We get a lot of pictures sent to us of house cats, like mysterious wildlife. Like, oh, well, it's got the pot belly, and you can see the tabby pattern on it.
Wow, house cats. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Lots and lots of house cats out there.
Lots of house cats. Let's see. A question for you. Are are opossums more active at night?
Yeah, definitely. Opossums are nocturnal. They can be active during the daytime, but for the most part, when they're going to be wandering around, it will be at night.
I noticed, I'm seeing this question. I'm like, oh yeah, you know what? We didn't really get into possums, which maybe that's, there's so many people, whether you live in an urban environment, suburban, exurban, rural environment, like we've all come across possum in North Carolina at some point. So maybe they're not the most exciting ones to talk about.
Opossums are really primordial animals. They're our only marsupial in North America, so they do have a pouch, and they're the only mammal that we have that is almost completely immune to rabies, immune to snake venom, but they're not very good at defending themselves. They do play dead when they feel threatened. So I think one of the reasons why they're nocturnal is because, if they get disturbed or bothered by predators, they don't really have much of a defense mechanism. They usually don't survive an encounter with a predator. So maybe it's safer for them to be awake at night.
In your work, educating the public about all of North Carolina's wildlife and biodiversity, do you find that people are more or less interested in learning about nocturnal creatures?
I think that there's an air of mystery about nocturnal animals because, when you go out during the daytime when most people are active, whether it's hiking or just spending time in your own yard or at a local park, you see the wildlife that's active at that point. But the nocturnal wildlife, which is there, it's very much there, but just not awake when you are. It feels like this mysterious hidden world of the wildlife that we don't see. So I think that air of mystery is part of the interest.
I wonder too. I think I would think that that's right. There's also, though, like the ones that we tend to be more afraid of seem to come out at night, and some for good reason, right? Like copperhead snakes tend to be more active at dusk and overnight, and we don't see very well at night, making it a lot easier for us to come across them, which is why we tell everybody, you like closed-toed shoes and flashlights if you're going outside, because we live with venomous snakes. But there seems to be so much more intrigue around what the animals of the night are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ever go out at night, and you hear nocturnal wildlife, hearing some weird animal making sounds that you're not familiar with and not being able to see what it is certainly can be pretty alarming. And I thought about adding some slides about sort of wildlife calls, but I didn't get around to it, and I apologize for that. But if you go online and you look for recordings of things like the sounds of bobcats, like bobcats calling, people say they sound like women screaming, which, imagine hearing that at night. If you hear a bobcat calling and you're like, I have no idea what that was, but I don't want to be anywhere near it. I think that's the case for a good number of our nocturnal species, especially mammals. Like foxes make crazy sounds when they're calling, barking and yipping and then howling and screeching. And then one of my favorite memories of learning about nocturnal wildlife is hearing flying squirrels for the first time. I didn't always know that flying squirrels commonly lived in places where I lived, like suburbs. So I remember hearing one, and they make this kind of high-pitched, weird, squealy sound. Like, what in the world is that? And then I was able to look it up and find out flying squirrels living in my backyard. How cool is that? And they're pretty common.
I have yet to see flying squirrels in the wild. I've been in North Carolina for a little while now, and it irks me that I've not
They're
seen.
there.
They apparently live like on the Capitol grounds here downtown. Still haven't seen one. I'm working on that, though.
Tricky nocturnal animals.
That's what it is. Okay, more questions for you from the chat. What is a typical day at work for you, or is it very different every day and unpredictable?
Oh goodness, it's different every day. To be completely honest, I do spend a lot of time in front of my computer. I do a lot of boring sounding management of programs, a lot of work coordinating response to things like beaver management issues and feral swine issues. So, I do some boring like program administration, but in terms of human wildlife interactions, it really, I can get calls about any number of things every day. And like, Falyn, we need you to help people learn about coyotes. Like we're having a issue in our town with coyotes. We need you to come and tell us what we need to do or how we need to respond. Or it could be squirrels, it could be raccoons, it could be any number of things. So never a dull moment.
Yeah, wow. Okay, let's see. Do you think the increase in wildlife sightings on home cameras has helped dispute misconceptions sometimes portrayed in the media?
I would like to think that as wildlife sightings in neighborhoods become more common and shareable. The great thing about a picture is you have proof. It's not just I saw something in my backyard. Like here, I can show you. This is to see this picture. As more people have those direct personal experiences, the mystery of what's really out there becomes a little bit less of a mystery and a little bit less of something that's newsworthy and just more common knowledge. Like, oh yeah, of course we have coyotes living in our neighborhood because people report sightings of them all the time, and we've got pictures on our next door account of all the coyotes. We've named them. That one's Joe and that one's Cynthia. So yeah, I think as that shareable data on the presence of nocturnal wildlife becomes more available to everyday people, then it will be easier for people to have a more accurate understanding of what wildlife is around them.
And I think too, or at least I hope, maybe I just wonder that with so many folks having access to resources, like it's easy to jump on the internet, type in the word bobcat, and then be directed to like a bobcat species profile on the Wildlife Resources Commission website or information about them, that if you do see one on your Ring doorbell camera or on your surveillance camera off your back porch, like in that news clip, even though the news media might be using words like terrifying and appears to be casually strolling, very obviously casually strolling by.
Yeah.
That if that's your camera, you then go, well, bobcat, should I be worried?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's lots of good information that's available now to like, no, yeah, bobcats live here and they're not a problem.
Yeah.
You probably never would have seen it had it not been for your camera.
That's right. There's definitely a lot of wonderful information just at your fingertips about all number of wildlife. There is a lot of bad information out there too. So be careful going down the YouTube rabbit hole or things like that. But from reputable sources like universities or state museums or state wildlife management agencies tend to have really high quality information about wildlife. So those are excellent places to learn about what did I just see on my Ring camera.
Let's see here. Sarah in the chat says, I have a persimmon tree in the backyard and something is very active in it every night. Would that be a raccoon or a possum, or could be either?
It could definitely be either, or it could be something else. Hard to say. So it sounds from those two guesses that it might be raccoon or opossum sized, which would certainly make either of those excellent guesses. But without more information, I mean, we've got tons of wildlife. Depending on where they are in the state, it could even be a bear. Lots of animals love persimmons. And if I was a nocturnal animal, I would be hanging out in the persimmon tree right now, because that's just, you don't even have to go anywhere. Just, yep, lunchtime, dinner time.
I even wonder if it could be a groundhog.
It could be. Yes. Yeah. Groundhogs do climb trees. They're very good climbers. It's weird.
You're going to have to set up a trail camera.
That's right. Get a trail camera and get some proof, some evidence of what's up there, and there you go. And there might be all three. It could be a raccoon, an opossum, and a groundhog, eating persimmons next to each other, chit chatting as they munch.
I love that. Let's see. One of our commenters listened to a podcast that talked about using recycled cell phones to record illegal logging, but also caught sounds of animals in the jungles of Indonesia.
Oh.
So that's really, there's all kinds of great ways to observe wildlife without having to be there, so that you can actually see them behaving naturally.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. I never heard about like the old cell phones, but we've got amazing technology now for recording the presence of wildlife without having to be present. It has its pros and cons. It's technology has a harder time right now at this state of what we have available, sort of parsing, is that a wild animal or is it not? So human beings are really good at sort of saying, oh yeah, that was definitely a turkey or a barn owl or whatever. And computers tend not to be as good at identifying things accurately, but of course that technology is always evolving and getting better and better. There's some companies working on some really exciting artificial intelligence like wildlife photo ID software. So you can run it through the software and they'll say, oh yeah, that was a raccoon, or that was a bobcat, or that was a feral pig. So that's coming down the pike.
Yeah, really cool stuff. Although, I brought up groundhogs, and Albert has seen groundhogs in persimmon trees during the day. Do groundhogs come out at night?
I think groundhogs are more diurnal. But that doesn't mean that they can't be awake at night if they want to be.
Okay. And this will be the last one, because I think this could be interesting. Sarah writes that they're in Raleigh, so probably not a black bear, right?
Well, we do get black bears that come through the Triangle area. Usually, one or two or a few per year. The Piedmont of North Carolina isn't really like the main area where our bear populations are. The bears are mostly in the mountains and on the coasts, but especially young males, when they decide to go off on their own, like I'm going to go and find a female to mate with, and I'm going to establish a territory, they're more likely to just go. Like some of them just they've got the bug to wander, and they will travel really long distances. And that's usually what happens when we see bear sightings here in Raleigh or the Triangle, is a young male bear who's wandering around, doesn't really know where it is. And most of the time they end up wandering back the way they came because they can't find any females. So they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to go back to bear territory and go find somebody to hang out with. So they usually don't stick around, but that might not always be the case. There's no reason why one might not decide to just stick around permanently. So we have some bears there. I would say they're pretty uncommon, but they're definitely around in the Piedmont.
Excellent stuff. And it looks like I did miss a question. Is there any research, or have any of the WRC biologists looked at the effects of artificial lighting on nocturnal animal behavior?
Oh, that definitely is something that can be a huge issue, especially for migrating songbirds. Like when birds are migrating, they usually migrate at night, and lights can distract them and be really disturbing for them. I was talking about sea turtles and lights at night being distracting or disorienting for them. So there are, I think, many instances where lights at night can be disturbing for wildlife, kind of disrupt their natural behaviors, or even just having a bright floodlight right where you're trying to sleep. I mean, nobody wants that. So a general rule of thumb is don't shine lights upward, like up into trees or up into the sky, where it's not really doing anybody any good. What we need to illuminate, human beings need to see the ground. So as long as the lights are facing downward, it's probably going to be less disturbing for wildlife. So that's what we advise across the board.
Excellent. Falyn, thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It was a fantastic presentation. So much great stuff to learn, and lots of great pictures too.
Oh, thanks. I stole them all from other people.
Right. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's program. We will be back here, of course, next week with Dr. Ron Sutherland from the Wildlands Network. He's going to be talking to us about red wolf conservation out in the eastern part of the state. So don't miss out on that one. That'll be noon next Wednesday right here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences YouTube channel. You can get updates about this program and more by following naturalsciences.org or follow the museum on social media. We're at Natural Sciences across all the platforms. You can follow the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education as well. They're on social media as North Carolina EE, and their website is a great resource, eenorthcarolina.org. And I am very certain that you can follow the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission as well, their website and social media accounts, and they are often sharing even more great stories about wildlife across our state. Falyn is like 2 thumbs upping that.
Yes.
That's perfect. So everybody, I hope that we'll see you again real soon. Take care, stay safe out there, and have a great week. Bye, everybody.